Hey guys, welcome back. It is your favorite Gimp with a Limp, and I'm here with the first part, kind of beginning with 1985 Sacred Oil. And this first video, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that's different that you hadn't seen in like 1985 Under an Iron Sky. And that's a lot of the stuff that doesn't actually take place here. Now, unfortunately, due to the scenario that I picked, due to size limitations, I can't really show some of this stuff in actual gameplay because a lot of it's like off map that's going on. So we're going to go over a lot of that now. Now, I printed out this, a little sequence of play. I just made a copy of it. And for some damn reason, they still won't include this thing. I don't get why they won't include it on a player aid. Maurizio, dude, pay attention. One of these on a player aid. You're killing me here, buddy. All right. But when we're looking at this, all right, sequence play, this is where we start and go down, do the whole nine. Weather is what we start with. I'm ignoring weather. It's an optional rule. And to be honest with you, in most war games, I hate weather. I don't know why. It's one of my quirks. I've always hated weather. I get why it's included in war games, but sometimes it just feels finicky to me. So if it's an optional rule, I always exclude it. Now, the stuff that I'm kind of going to be touching on now is going to be this like 2, 3, 4. All right, so tension phase, convoy phase, external events phase. And we're going to be going over a lot of that in generalities. Now, the deal with that stuff is that in this game, a big portion of it is not necessarily the combat that's taking place in front of you. And this is one of the aspects that I got to say doesn't solitaire well, okay? And for the most part, the game plays fine. I mean, you're playing both sides. It's a war game, just like so many others that I've solitaired. That aspect of it, this aspect, what you're looking at on the table, perfectly fine, no problem. Friggin' blast to play, thinking, counter-thinking, moves, this, all that good stuff. No problem there. But when it comes to this stuff, the tension phase stuff, that has to do with the political victory of the game. All right? And that's the... Does he know what I know, that he thinks he knows, that I don't know, and blah, 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 blah. Now, the big portion of this is actually, it's referenced here in the scenario booklet. This is not in the rule booklet, so make sure you read the scenario booklet. The first few pages of that has a lot of rules. Some apply to some scenarios, some don't. Of course, if you're playing a campaign game, everything's going to apply. But the big part of it is this Soviet plan here, right? And I'm probably going to mispronounce the living shit out of this, but whatever. Operation Baikal and Operation Ladoga are what I'm talking about. And if you guys watched the interview we did with Fabrizio and Tony when we were talking about this game, this is the big portion of this that I'm talking about. And a lot of this has to do with these tension cards that I'm going to touch on here in a minute, as well as that lock map as well. The thing that looks like an area control map of the world. The Operation Baikal part, that has to be decided before the game plays. All right, so kind of think we're playing a campaign game, whole brigamore, the whole thing. The Soviet player is going to write down separately what turn that operation is going to begin, and you're going to keep that to the side until the tension phase of the turn in which it's going to start. But you're going to do the same thing for Operation Ladoga as well, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. But the thing of it is, Ladoga doesn't have to be kicked into play. Baikal does, all right? So basically what the Soviets are thinking is they're doing an offensive in this area, in the Persian Gulf. And it's what level of an offensive are they doing? Are they doing this just to gain control so they can go balls to the wall and they're wanting to deny NATO a strategic asset, all right? Because I was reading the history that they have, and you got to read the history at the back of the, I think it's a scenario booklet where they were talking about designer's notes. Yeah, a lot of good stuff that they were talking about, why they made the choices they did. But Russia, or Soviet Union, was very oil independent. They didn't need the oil from this region as much, but the NATO forces did. So if the Soviet Union came in and didn't necessarily attack NATO, now, of course, them being all active here is going to increase their tensions and going to war with the US, but not necessarily NATO and the Warsaw Pact. All right. So not necessarily kicking off World War III, but just kind of hinting around at it. That's the choice that they've got to make. And that has to do with those two operations, Baikal and Ladoga. Baikal has to be picked, right? So you have to pick a turn as a Soviet player that you're going to begin that operation. And it's the choice on whether or not you are going for just controlling this, or if this is kind of a feint because you're getting ready to launch that full operation against NATO. So you're going to be fighting in Europe as well, right? They're going to be pushing across whatever it was there in Eastern and Western Germany, the bloc, and starting the war and the tanks and all that good stuff. So that's what they're doing. They're trying to kind of mess with the NATO powers, the US's head on what their real goal is. But that also changes the goal of the Soviet player on what they have to do. If they don't kick off Operation Ladoga, which is the full all-out assault against NATO, Warsaw Pact gets involved. Think Under an Iron Sky is also being kicked into play as well, not just conflict here. Then the Soviet forces have to gain control of the entire Persian Gulf. And basically what they're looking for is that they would control it and the NATO forces would still be buying their oil from here. World War III might not necessarily have actually kicked off, but the Soviets are going to have the reigning control of what's going on in the area. But if they do kick off Ladoga and they cross the line and do all that, then this is just a feint. And what they are wanting is for the US, the French, the British, and whoever else to commit significant resources to this area because they're not as concerned with it, right? They don't necessarily need the oil from here, but they know that NATO forces do. So by siphoning those forces away down here, they're not going to be available up there in Europe. So just like with Baikal, Ladoga is also going to be decided before the game starts, and you'll let the opponent know on the piece of paper when that kicks off, but it might not necessarily be kicked off. And that's the thing. With this game, you're shooting first for a political victory, not necessarily the military victory. Now, if it's a tie, then you're going to look at the military aspect and who performed better, but you're trying to ascertain certain goals. Or should I say attain certain goals. Now, when we're looking here, and this is also in the scenario booklet, this has to do with that political victory, and it shows for the Soviet faction and for the US faction, there are certain things that they want. Like the Soviets are going to instigate a conflict with Iran because Iraq is generally the Soviets' ally, and Iran collapsing is going to give them points. But each port in Iran under Soviet control, each oil field under Soviet control, what is that? All Bandar Abbas hexes, whatever the hell that means. Iraq joined Soviet Union. So there's a lot of things that gain them political victory points, right? NATO first to use nuclear weapons. That gets them points. But you also lose points for nuclear attacks on cities or urban hexes. And it's the same way here with the US forces, right? So they get points for people joining their faction, for Operation Ladoga being executed, but NATO mobilized before the start of it, because NATO has choices as well. And one of their choices is, are they going to mobilize? Is NATO going to kick off things and be prepared? Because there's gear up time, right? You don't just say, I'm going to war, and it happens instantaneously. A lot of these units, formations, everything, they have to be geared up. The people have to be put in the right places. Equipment has to be transferred. So you don't want your enemy to do that before you're ready. And that's part of the Soviet strategy, is causing certain units to be moved into different areas where they're not necessarily going to be needed, but where they think they're going to be needed. And then the NATO faction, if they've geared up their forces in time to block the Soviet forces, they get the bonus. But if they haven't, Ladoga kicks off and NATO hasn't mobilized, well, then that goes in the Soviets faction or Soviets' favor because they got ready before NATO did. Basically, you're looking at it, you're trying to catch your opponent with their pants down, but you don't know where the punch is coming from. Is he throwing a left hook, a right hook? Which way is he coming? And if you guess wrong, you're going to get your clock cleaned. But if you guess right, you're going to take your opponent out. All right, so you guys forgive me for the kind of ghetto way that I've got this all laid out here over to the side, but the map is big and I don't have a whole lot of space for it. But so much thought and effort went into this. All right, this lock map here that I really wanted to be able to show it in all its glory. Now, we had touched on earlier, this is your movement point modifiers track. You can use a D20, a couple of D20, something like that, or you can use this, whatever works for you. Turn record track up here. Those are real basic. A couple of key things that you're looking at is your tension track and your commitment track. Commitment track has to do with the countries. And when we pop back over there, I'll show you the differences with those. But it has to do with how committed they are to their side, right? So Iran kind of joining in with NATO and the US faction, Iraq joining in with the Soviets. And the more commitment they have, the more likely they are to be favorable and do the things that you want them to do. Key thing has to do with there's kind of the secondary war going on with all of this, all right? These little area control points. And this has a lot to do with those event cards that I'm actually getting ready to show you guys. And that's because each side has different areas they're having to worry about. Like the Afghan front is an area that the Soviets have to worry about during the game. And forces that they have committed over there. Big thing for the US and the NATO faction has to do with all these blue lines, and these are sea lines of communication because they're having to transport in those supplies. They have to set up convoys, and you have little convoy counters that are going to go over here. And the key thing is it's not just those convoy counters. It's air units, it's sea units as well. All that type stuff cannot just be on the tactical map. It can be over here on this map as well. And you have to worry about whether Soviet subs are going to try to sink them along their way over here. And they can interdict and cut off your supply lines if you're the NATO faction. So we've got the Pacific sea lines of communication, the Mediterranean, the Cape of Africa, and we've got the Atlantic in there at the top. What is that called? GIUK. So the United Kingdom front, and all those are the key lines of communication supply that are coming into the area where we're focused on a small portion of the global conflict that's going on. All right, and again, remember, I'm trying to kind of hit the highlights of a lot of this stuff very quickly. So like what I was talking about with the commitment levels for the different nations, Iraq and Iran in this scenario both start at level 3. But when you're looking at your different commitment, at 0, you're not going to have any friendly faction access to territory, airspace, bases, none of that. Basically, you can't do anything. Units of the country can't be moved unless at war with another country. And as you go up, basically, they're going to start doing more and more and more and more for you. At our level, where we're starting at 3, units of the friendly faction have access to the country's airspace, bases, and territory. Airfields in the country's territory can be made operational by the friendly faction. Naval and anti-submarine warfare surveillance areas can be established using the country's bases, and units of the country cannot be moved unless at war with another country, but they are at war with another country. And at level 4, when we get there, they basically join the faction. They're full on, they're committed. So you're sitting here going, okay, Gimpy, well, how does the commitment level change? Well, that can change during a number of different things, like Soviet Union declaring war on Iran. That's going to increase Iran's commitment level. Or we've got things like our event cards, which we're going to take a look at now, which can ultimately change certain things, like the commitment levels. Okay, so when we're talking about the cards, we're talking about here in this tension phase. All right, so the Soviet player is going to select their faction cards that they want to play, and then there's some rolling that happens that potentially has the US player discover Soviet event cards, and they get that tension cost. Basically, they get so much that they get to spend, and they're rolling on the tension table, and then they get to play their own cards. The NATO and the US faction are very much kind of reactionary in this game and how they do things. And you can tell that by looking at the cards. Now, the ones with the red back, these are the Soviets, and obviously the blue star on the back of these, this is NATO faction. When you're looking at it, these circles tell you some very key things. All right, that first red number, that has to do with the tension level. So when we're looking at that lock map over there, it has to be at that tension level to be able to play that card. But if you look at all the Soviet cards, you'll notice they're all 0. Doesn't matter. The Soviets can play whatever they want to play. Thing is, the more of these they play, the more expensive cards they play, the more units they kind of bring out into the game, the more that gives the US access to their cards, because they kind of get to spend in proportion to what the Soviet faction is going to do. So just an example, looking at the one that we've got here, this is a Spetsnaz team assassinating the Ayatollah. And that is something that can cause Iran's commitment level to go up or down, and you're going to permanently remove this card from play after you get done doing it. There are other cards that will add units to the game, or they might put units there on the lock map, things like that. And when I was talking about setup previously, remember that some of these counters have specific spots on the board. They'll have a hex that lists down that they go in that specific spot. Well, some counters have a card. So it will say whatever card there in that upper left, and it'll tell you which one's going to cause that unit to deploy. So just as an example, looking at this one, if we wanted to play this is for the NATO faction. You see it has to have a tension level of 6, so it has to be fairly high. It costs 4 to play, and that green number in that circle, that has to do with the victory point cost for the tension level, or the tension cost for that. But with this, you would deploy 3 US aircraft with the E-34, so it'll have that code on the counter, and you're going to deploy them onto the lockbox. So the CONUS 1, Continental United States 1 lockbox on that map. All right, so in the course of the gameplay, you're going to be playing these cards back and forth during this little tension phase, and in a way, it kind of gives the Soviet player, I think, a bit of an edge, because they almost get to decide how fast things are going to progress depending on what cards they choose to play. Now, there is a role to the game where the US player doesn't get to reveal all the Soviet cards. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So if they're lucky, they reveal good ones and it gets them some good cards to respond with. But these next 2 phases have to do with that, because you're going to set up your convoys. Like I said, there are counters to represent your convoys for your supply lines. And then this external events phase, this kind of threw me at first when I was reading the game, learning the rules to it. I was like, what the hell is this talking about? This has to do a lot with these cards that are being played to that lock map, because combat, just like it takes place here on the usual map that we're used to playing on, can take place on that lock map. That's what it's referring to. So when you're playing your game, this external events phase has to do with the combat and the events that you have from the played cards. And that's one of the things that I discovered when I was looking over the forces that you have access to. When it comes to real ground forces, real forces that are getting stuck in and getting involved, yeah, the US and the Soviets and the others have some ground forces they can commit, but not a lot. Most of their forces are aircraft, helicopters, and ships from both of them, all right? And even the NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries, they're not exactly committing a whole lot of ground forces to this theater. It has more to do with those. So you can see this is not the main focus of the ground war, right? This is tangential to it, but has a key and pivotal role into how the war is going to play out. If the U.S. takes and doesn't commit enough forces down here, and the Soviets come in and take control of the area, and they are actually kicking off Ladoga, and they're going after NATO full on and really kicking things off. Well, the NATO faction has lost a key resource that's really going to put them on the back foot. But on the other hand, if they come in, swinging the sledgehammer, trying to knock everything back, and the Soviets were like, we just had some regional forces in the area, we weren't that worried about it, and they overcommit to it. Well, now they've left themselves bare up there in Europe, and the Soviets have the chance to come in and steamroll. That, I gotta say, is my favorite aspect of the game. I mean, don't get me wrong, the game is great. You can really tell, just like with 1985 Under an Iron Sky, the amount of blood, sweat, and tears they put into this. They've really researched it. It's one of those labors of love where it's a passion project. You know what I mean? You can tell they love what they work on. But all the thought that went behind it, and tweaking that lockbox, and thinking about the external conflicts that are going on outside of this. And while this might be a more minor theater in the grand scheme of things, it does play that pivotal role, and it can change the entire landscape of the world depending on how things do play out here. It's really neat how they came up with all that. All right, but I know I've been rambling on for a while. There's so much to cover here, and that, again, is part of the reason that I set this up in a spare room where I just have the access to leave it up as long as I want, right? I don't have to worry about anything else coming in that I have to get to, that this is going to have to come up, and I'm going to play it out because I was thinking some strategies. So we're going to finish up this video showing you guys what I've got placed out as far as all the units and what my thought process was. All right, so I might zoom in or magnify just depending, but this is the south. We're going to start south and work our way up. Got all the units kind of spaced out around. Again, the naval forces are here at their ports. Haven't exactly decided what I'm going to do with those yet. I'm going to see how this ground war plays out. Now, the key thing down here is there's some big cities both sides want to control, but there's a lot of forces in a real small area. But these rivers, these are all major rivers, and the only crossings are in their own territory. So these river the bridges here are in Iraq, and the bridges here are in Iran. So the war has to kick off, which again leaves only this small little stretch here. Now, you guys saw in the previous video how I decided to deploy out the Iraqi forces. And in here, I kind of decided to go with a two-pronged defensive line for the Iran forces. Got one line kind of here, all right, because there's one, I think, bridgehead. Yeah, there's one bridgehead there. And, of course, I'm knocking around my counters. Put that back there. Stop knocking shit around. One little bridgehead there, and the little land bridge here for them to get across. But that's it. So they can only really make one push here, and they can push around in this direction if they can get a pincer going. When the real conflict starts, the key thing that I was worried about was them swinging around over here. But I didn't want to stretch the supply lines and get units caught out here where they were, just subject to being brothel stomped. So kind of left some of the Iranian forces back. This way, these forces can try to hold, and there is an artillery here that can provide support as they're getting attacked, right? So it's all going to be defensive. But the key thing is I kept back some tanks and some infantry over here. That way, even if these guys fall, for them to continue their push over here to where there's another major city, they only have a few bridges, which gives them a defensive bonus. Plus, I've got another artillery over here stacked with them. That way, the artillery can provide support. So there's artillery here for defensive support. Artillery, I think he's right here. Yeah, he's right there for defensive support as well. Now, the Iraqis have one they can use for offensive support, but I don't anticipate him doing too much. I knocked over this infantry. I don't remember where he was. I think it was right about there, but no big deal. But this way, it kind of funnels them, I'm hoping, because there's a river going all the way up here. There's no real other crossing until they get up there. and that's going to push their supply lines. So their headquarters would have to push up over here to extend their supply over in this direction. Plus, the Iranians really don't have anything to defend against this whole line. So everything here can commit to smashing these forces, and I really didn't have anything to block these guys. So they're pretty much going to come in and ruffle stuff, unfortunately. All right, so when I was looking at the middle forces, there were two smaller Iraqi stacks. There was one here and then one here that needed to be placed out within 10 hexes of their area. I think there's a little city here and one over here. And they were all set up relatively similar. HQ, armor, one mechanized, and then, some infantry. Pretty much same over here, maybe an artillery in there as well. But there was only one good size stack over here of Iranian units. So what I decided to do was to try to use this river as a defensive line, because it's not good to attack across the river. You get penalties for doing so. They get defensive bonuses. This way they have to push and stretch their supply lines. I'm in my supply lines over here with the Iranian forces. That way, hopefully it kind of stretches them a little bit. But like I said, they've got extra forces down here to push down to kind of envelop. And then over here, these guys can come up and come around, but I didn't really have a whole lot to block. Just trying to kind of hold the line here. I do have an artillery there, and I think I got another one up over here somewhere. Yeah, right over here for defensive fire. Right over here, defensive fire right over here, because there's a bridge, and then there's another bridge over here somewhere. Oh, there's these, but there's no other bridges, so they would have to come down over here or cross here. This way, these forces are gonna kind of have to funnel this direction or attack across the river. Neither one's gonna be good for them, so it's basically just a holding action here. Now, this is to the north, and unfortunately, it just wasn't too good for the Iranians. They really don't have a whole lot of good stuff. They did have a small amount of numerical superiority here, and I decided I'd try to exploit it, because this is the closest group to Baghdad. Baghdad's right here, so I figure if the dice gods can favor me just a little bit here, attack, get these guys enveloped, take them out, and then push with whatever's left and hopefully go after here. But I did leave a couple of good-sized tank divisions over here. And then on top of that, they've got a fair amount of air support. And I left an artillery over here as well for Baghdad. So even if the units smash everything here and push in, because that's what I was kind of hoping, is that I might be able to take Baghdad for a surrender for Iraq. I don't know if it'll work. Besides, I think that the Iraqis do have the ability. They have to take, I want to say it's either 4 or 5, I can't remember off the top of my head, oil fields as a victory condition as well. There's one here, one out here, and then another one back over there. So it just depends on how well that holding action goes south. And if the dice gods can favor me a little bit here, maybe swing out, get a little bit of a pincer while these other guys kind of push in. If I can do well here, might be able to get a little bit of a breakthrough going. And I forgot to mention, I did pick to put my one little helicopter that the Iranians have over here in hopes that it might be able to do some good with this attack, because they don't have a whole lot of air defenses here, just the intrinsic stuff. The Iranians did, but again, not too much, mostly intrinsic. And this last point up here, pretty much the same thing as the middle, holding action right here by the river. These guys were actually supposed to be over there within 10 hexes, so I spread them out here along the line in the mountains in the hopes that they would just be able to hold back any attack from coming over here. There is that light river that runs right here through the mountains. It's not good fighting terrain. It's good for defense. And these guys are not alpine units, so they're not exactly going to get any attacking bonuses. So I'm hoping they just do a hold here. Just keep these guys occupied so they can't come over here and get into the back. Yeah, so I'm not expecting too much out of the Iranian forces. They don't have a whole lot, and the little bit that they are going to get, as far as like air power, it's not really going to help much because I think turn 4 they get some U.S. air power, but at the same time the Iraqis get some Soviet air power at the same time, same turn, and it's I think the same amount, 4 airplanes each, which I mean that's not going to do them a whole lot of good. So they're kind of screwed. Like I said, it's pretty much hold, try to smash, and then hold there at the top. And the Iraqis are all about just pushing in and seeing if they can overwhelm here, and especially there in the middle. Maybe I should like take a picture or something because I know I'm gonna like sneeze and like blow a bunch of counters everywhere and cry. When we get started, though, we will pick up with the air superiority phase, which is going to be using these couple of counters. Each side has access to one, and honestly, I'm thinking the Iranis don't even put one out because that just gives the opportunity for the Iraqis to have 2 air superiority areas. I want to hold on to whatever air power they have for defensive actions, just trying to keep the Iraqis from using their overwhelming amount of air power to smash them, right? Hold on to the few jets they have for key offensives. Yeah, I eyeballed it again. I miscounted. They don't have 4. They have 3 air-to-air fighters. That's it. They're decent. They're decent air-to-air fighters, but they're going to be outnumbered in every conflict the Iranians get involved in. All right, well, we will pick up on the next turn. We'll start with the air superiority. That's actually going to go fairly quick because, like I said, I'm not doing too much with Iran on that one. And we'll get into the ground conflict because I'm really interested to see how this is going to play out down here, whether or not Iran can hold or if Iraq's going to be able to smash or not. The Iran forces did have some Marine infantry as well. The pissant infantry, as I like to call it. So there's a couple of them there, but they're just a touch better than the Iraqis, which is like saying, you know, they're the smarter kid on the short bus, but But they do have a tank here, so their Marine forces aren't going to be able to attack across. I'm not too worried about them coming across down here to the south because it's all major river hex sides. It's just going to be too tough to fight across. They're going to have to come around in this direction, and there's just a wall of units to keep them from doing it. All right, well, we'll see how it all pans out. You guys have any questions, by all means, put them down below. Y'all take care. I'll see you in the next one.